Scotland. It's going to stay blustery on Thursday, but a little brighter with further cloud breaks developing. Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the issues that we should be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and nobody will be cancelled for saying what they think. Here's what we've got coming up on today's show. We need to talk about Ukraine, with escalating warnings about a Russian invasion threatening to plunge Europe and the world into war. How worried should we be? And police are now investigating the Downing Street parties, causing the much-anticipated Sue Gray reports to be delayed. So is this a reprieve for Boris Johnson? Plus, after the Met were forced to apologise and compensate a woman over the way she was treated during a strip search, how do we restore trust in policing? That's what we're talking about for the next hour, but what do you need to talk about? Email me, gbnews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me @gbnews. But first, it's time for the GB News headlines with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's just 1 minute past 2. I'm Rosie Wright to keep you up to date. The Prime Minister has warned that if the worst happens in Ukraine, the bloodshed would be comparable to the first war in Chechnya or Bosnia. Russia has amassed around 100,000 troops at its border with Ukraine. Well, Boris Johnson told MPs if there's a Russian invasion, the British Army will protect its allies and will look to contribute to any new NATO deployments. He also says sanctions against Moscow would be severe, inflicting pain on the Russian economy.
Any attack on his neighbour would be followed by tougher sanctions against Russia, further steps to help Ukraine defend herself, and by an increased NATO presence to protect our allies on NATO's eastern flank. The truth is that Russia's goal is to keep NATO forces away from her borders. If that is Russia's goal, then invading Ukraine could scarcely be more counterproductive.
Well, the Labour leader Keir Starmer said the UK must show Russia that any further aggression will result in severe real-world consequences. We'll have more on this story as it develops. Well, ahead of his statement on Ukraine, Boris Johnson told the Commons he welcomes the investigation into alleged parties at Downing Street during lockdown. Number 10 has admitted the Prime Minister had a birthday celebration in June 2020 when COVID restrictions were in place. Earlier, the Met Police Commissioner, Dame Cressida Dick, confirmed a number of events are being looked at after officers were given information from the Sue Gray inquiry.
I absolutely understand that there is deep public concern about the allegations that have been in the media over the last several weeks. As a result, firstly, of the information provided by the Cabinet Office inquiry team, and secondly, my officer's own assessment, I can confirm that the Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years in relation to potential breaches of COVID-19 regulations.
Royal Mail has announced it's cutting 700 management jobs. They say it will save around £40 million a year. It follows what's been a difficult period over Christmas and New Year, with staff absences peaking at 15,000 at one point because of coronavirus. Bosses say they'll hold talks with unions over the proposed job losses. Well, in other business news, Unilever is cutting around 1,500 jobs globally as part of what they've described as a group-wide overhaul. Well, the consumer goods giant, which makes Dove and Marmite, is planning to axe around 15% of senior management roles and 5% of junior roles to create 5 business divisions. It says jobs will be lost in the UK and worldwide, but stressed factory teams aren't expected to be impacted. There are new calls for the national insurance hike to be scrapped. The former Brexit chief, Lord Frost, has joined now a growing number of senior Conservatives asking Boris Johnson not to raise the tax in April. With the cost of living set to increase, he told the Daily Mail the £12 billion increase is not necessary or justified. Ground rents are going to be abolished for most new long residential leaseholds in England and Wales. The law will restrict ground rents to a token 1 peppercorn per year, which effectively has no financial value. Well, the Communities Minister, Eddie Hughes, says it will make a real difference to thousands of future leaseholders. The University of Oxford's looking for 6,000 patients to trial a new COVID antiviral drug. Well, they say it should help alleviate symptoms and prevent serious illness. Adults over the age of 50 and those with underlying health problems are being urged to come forward. The US President Joe Biden's been caught out on camera swearing at a reporter while his microphone was still switched on. After a press conference, journalists were being ushered out of the White House when a correspondent shouted a question about the impact of inflation on this year's congressional elections. Well, Joe Biden responded without realising his microphone was still active.
Do you think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a...
You're up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now, Alex, and we need to talk about.
How scared should we be? Seriously. Russia is planning to carry out naval drills off the coast of Ireland, having recently conducted joint exercises with China and Iran. Parts of the Russian military advance force are already inside Ukraine, according to UK intelligence. Meanwhile, Britain and the US are evacuating embassy staff from Kiev in fear of an aerial bombardment of Ukraine's capital. As the West's leaders met virtually to weigh up what may or may not be in shared national interests, with a deafening silence from Berlin, it seems like Biden's throwaway comment about minor incursions into Ukraine could easily become a reality if the West continues to struggle to get its act together. While war could well be very costly for Russia, how does Putin de-escalate now? Surely he needs to walk away with something. And what does that mean for us? It's all getting extremely tense, and Britain's right in the middle of it all. Boris Johnson says the UK will contribute to NATO troop deployments if Russia does invade Ukraine.
The British Army leads the NATO battle group in Estonia, and if Russia invades Ukraine, we would look to contribute to any new NATO deployments to protect our allies in Europe. In every contact with Russia, the UK and our allies have stressed our unity and our adherence to vital points of principle. We cannot bargain away the vision of a Europe whole and free that emerged in those amazing years from 1989 to 1991, healing the division of our continent by the Iron Curtain. We will not reopen that divide by agreeing to overturn the European security order because Russia has placed a gun to Ukraine's head. Nor can we accept the doctrine implicit in Russian proposals that all states are sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by former head of the British Army, General Lord Richard Dannard. Lord Richard, thank you so much for coming on. What do you think about the current situation? NATO, of course, is saying they're preparing for the worst possible outcome. What would that be?
Well, the worst possible outcome is if Mr. Putin was unwise enough to make a significant incursion and invasion into Ukraine. But I believe that he would be very unwise to do that. And I'd also like to think that he's beginning to realize that he would be very unwise to do that. We've got to put this thing back into context. Scrape Vladimir Putin to the core, and you find an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact was defeated by the cohesion and harmony of the West and NATO in 1989, 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down. He would love nothing more than to threaten, intimidate, pose challenges, ask questions of the West, so that our unity breaks up, and that he could feel that his epitaph would be to the man who broke up NATO. That's what he's really trying to achieve. But unfortunately, from his point of view, that's now beginning to unravel, because a little bit belatedly, but in time, the leadership of the United States, the United Kingdom, NATO and the European Union, amongst others, possibly with the exception of Germany, is now saying, hang on, this won't do. And there is a fairly unified voice coming out to say that we respect Ukraine's sovereign right to be a sovereign territory. No, you're not part of NATO, so we're not going to come and fight for you, but we'll support you. And Mr. Putin, the game's up, your bluff is being called.
If his bluff has indeed been called, then that means he's walking away with nothing. He's put on quite a prize performance, but essentially he's not really achieved anything. Surely he's going to want something to take away from all of this, having exerted so many efforts.
Oh, he can walk away with saying that he's exercised 100,000 of his troops in the middle of the Russian winter, and they performed fantastically on their exercises. If he wants to walk away, he can walk away. If he chooses not to walk away, and he chooses to make an incursion, however great or small, whether from the east of Ukraine or down from Belarus, he will get a very bloody nose. The Ukrainians are not a walkover. We've all been supporting the Ukrainian armed forces in their training in recent years. They're a much stronger force than they were. They've been well reinforced and with weapons from the West, and the Russians will get a very bloody nose. Yes, the Russians will probably prevail, but it'll be a very high cost, and there'll be a very consistent stream of body bags flowing back into Russia. Mr. Putin knows this. He's there to threaten, he's there to intimidate. I don't believe he wants to fight. I could be proved wrong. You can have a laugh at me in 2 or 3 days' time if you want. But I believe that his game is one of bluff, it's one of high stakes. And this ridiculous notion of suggesting that NATO should no longer place troops in former Soviet and communist bloc countries in Eastern Europe, that is quite ridiculous, and it completely overlooks the fact that countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Romania only became communist because they were invaded and liberated, if you like, by the Red Army in 1943, 44, 45. But the Red Army then never withdrew, and those countries were communist for many decades because they had been defeated by the Red Army. So these countries have a right to be independent, they have a right to be sovereign, they have a right to be democratic if they wish. But Ukraine, quite sensibly, we've not brought into the membership of NATO because there's this very special relationship, in many Russians' minds in particular, between Russia and Ukraine. Remember that Khrushchev, that former Soviet leader, was himself Ukrainian. And there was a belief, there is a belief, that Ukraine will ever be spiritually, emotionally part of Russia. We have to remember that. But it puts Ukraine in a very different position from all those other countries which are NATO members, and we will of course support them. And Prime Minister Johnson is absolutely right to say further British troops will deploy to Poland or Estonia or whatever, to support those member nations who are friends of ours and fellow members of NATO.
I mean, if this was an exercise to look for an Achilles heel or fault lines when it comes to Western alliances, he really has kind of smoked out Germany on this one, hasn't he? Because the German head of the Navy has resigned, saying he doesn't believe there's going to be a Russian invasion. Germany's been deafeningly quiet, allegedly have stopped Estonia sending, who are, NATO members, sending arms to Ukraine, and of course allegedly also blocked the transportation of defence warfare materials across German airspace to the Ukraine, something of course that Berlin has denied. But he has actually potentially made fools of the West in this instance, hasn't he?
No, he hasn't made fools of the West. The West is, as I said, slightly belatedly now standing up and speaking, with the exception of Germany, increasingly with one voice to say, no, we won't be split on this issue. We are quite clear that Ukraine is not a NATO member, yet we totally recognise the right for her to defend her sovereignty, but we will protect other NATO members. Now, Germany has put herself in rather a difficult position. We all know that Germany is increasingly relying on gas, which comes from Russia through this controversial pipeline. And although we all think that Chancellor Merkel has played a wonderful hand over the last 14 years, on this issue, there's been a bit of a miscalculation. So Germany needs to think long and hard about the approach that it's taking and not give Putin the satisfaction of seeing Germany as the chink in the armour of NATO. NATO must be stronger than that and must face down Putin on this issue. Germany's got to think very closely about her own position.
What do you make of these exercises off the coast of Ireland, outside of their territorial waters, but in their economic areas? Should we be alarmed at Russia showing such aggression very close to our shores?
I'm afraid that's normal business. I don't know whether any of your viewers have been watching the series on Warship. Well, the last episode that I saw, and as a former head of the Army, I'm very happy to watch the Navy on manoeuvres, was all about a Royal Navy frigate shadowing a Russian intelligence gathering ship off Ireland. This happens. I'm afraid we live in the real world where the tensions between Russia, largely Russian instigated, and the West have been continuing for quite some time and will continue to do so. So we mustn't over-dramatize these things. And there is a risk that we overhype, that we get over-concerned. But the really key thing here, and I stress it, is that the NATO members, the countries of the West, speak with one voice and show Mr. Putin he's not going to divide the West. He's not going to divide NATO. He's not going to topple NATO, because actually we don't believe in being intimidated and being bullied just because he can put 100,000 soldiers on the Ukrainian border. Not good enough.
Lord Richard Dannett, thank you so much for joining me and giving your expert analysis of this situation. Really appreciate it. Well, let's talk now to Keir Giles, who's an expert in Russian power projection at Chatham House, the international affairs think tank. Keir, what do you think about the latest developments? Are you as sanguine as Lord Dannett there, and thinking that this is all a sort of screenplay by Putin to look for fault lines in the Western alliance, and actually he's been found wanting and we're in an OK situation?
Well, I agree completely with the assessment of the situation. What I think is lacking in most of the analysis that we've heard so far of what's going on is that everybody's talking about the worst case scenario. Everybody's talking specifically about a land invasion of Ukraine. And all of the Western responses that we've heard, including from Boris Johnson, are tied to that one very specific event, because everybody seems to have been mesmerized by this troop buildup opposite the Ukrainian border. The problem is there is so much else that Russia could do to cause damage, to try and reinforce these demands, to roll back the clock and roll back NATO that you heard Lord Dannett talking about just now. And those wouldn't necessarily involve moving troops into Ukraine. In fact, the more we say that that is the one single event that is going to trigger a Western response, the less likely it is to happen, and the more likely Putin is to look for other ways of making his displeasure felt.
Well, let's talk about those other ways. Are we sort of looking at the sort of tampering or manipulation of the cost of energy in Europe that plays very much into, Russian leverage when it comes to geopolitics? Or are there other things that you think Russia could do to threaten us?
When we talk about Russia manipulating energy prices and using energy as a weapon, as with so much else, we need to talk about them doing it more than they already are doing at this point. In a lot of these cases, it's a question of degree. Let's not forget that when we talk about an invasion of Ukraine, we're talking about Russia invading it more than it already has. Ukraine's already been at war for 8 years. And that also goes for a lot of the other measures that Russia could actually take. If it's cyber attacks, if it's destabilization, if it's subversion, trying to bring about some kind of regime change without actually invading the country, that's part of the standard Russian practice for getting its way in geopolitical terms around Europe. So we need to be alert to all of the different things that we have already seen, as well as new threats emerging, like, for example, what could Russia do with those naval exercises you mentioned off the coast of Ireland, which Irish parliamentarians have pointed out is in a location which is pretty inconvenient for shipping lanes, flight paths, subsea cables. Let's not be too surprised if there is some kind of fictitious emergency or fictitious incident that happens during those exercises, because Ireland, too, is a non-NATO member, just like Ukraine.
It seems to me that Putin is rather like a wasp at a picnic, and while we have to be prepared for the worst possible outcome, at the moment it seems that there's a consensus that, well, he's an annoyance and we've got to show that we won't tolerate his misdemeanours. But, I mean, there is a risk, isn't there, that nobody really predicts war as and when it happens. Intelligence in the UK has said that there could be an aerial bombardment of Kiev. They've gone to the lengths of actually taking some of the embassy staff out of Ukraine's capital, as have America. We've started talking about committing troops there. We've already sending defence weaponry over to the Ukraine. I mean, that's a lot of effort if people think that Putin's not up for actually putting boots on the ground.
Well, you don't need to put boots on the ground to launch a missile or an airstrike on Kiev in exactly the same way that Russia carried out airstrikes on civilian population centers in Syria. That, too, is a standard part of Russian practice. In terrorizing the civilian population into giving in is part of what Russia thinks is essential for winning wars. So it is prudent to pull embassy staff back from Kiev if they're not essential for being there, because this is something that could start at any moment. But here's the key thing. It doesn't actually meet those criteria of being a land invasion that everybody in the West is pinning their responses on. So where would the West be now? They have to start that conversation all over again in terms of how to respond to something which isn't what they were expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I asked Lord Dan at this, and I'm going to ask you the same. I mean, if Putin's gone through all of these efforts to show Russian might, Russian aggression, Russian intention, Russian opinion on geopolitics, then surely he can't retract now. He can't just go back to the Kremlin in Moscow and squirrel himself away and say, job done. He must take home something. What does he want? What is he going to take home as his prize for all of this?
Well, first of all, it's reasonable for Russia to expect that out of all of these demands that they've put to the US and NATO, effectively demilitarizing the east of Europe, rolling NATO back, rolling back the clock to Russia having a free hand in that Eastern European region, Russia might get something because of the past track record of European leaders actually giving in to this kind of pressure and giving Russia concessions. So there might be something that they can point to as what looks like a compromise from the West, but is in fact a disaster for the security of those people living in those regions. But there are other things that Russia can do specifically with those troops that are lined up on Russian territory. After all, a move into Belarus would still be presented as a success for Russia because it causes substantial headaches for the West and for NATO. And it looks like Russia actually securing Belarus against this fictitious Western expansion that Putin is complaining about. And let's not forget that a lot of those troops, the ones that are not already on exercise in Belarus, are actually closer to Belarus than they are to Ukraine. So once again, Russia's options are wide open, and the worst thing to do is box ourselves into one possible course of development of how this might play out and expect that it's going to follow that.
Keir, thank you so much. I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this again very soon because this problem is not going to disappear, is it? Keir Giles there from Chatham House, an expert on Russian power projection. What power they seem to be trying to project. I really want to know your views on this situation. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Are you preoccupied by this? I mean, I am. I'm not necessarily losing sleep over it, but it's all rather fascinating. And I do feel like the West has been caught napping when it comes to some of Putin's power plays, particularly when it comes to games over energy prices. You can also tweet us at GB News and I'll get to find out what you, the nation, really thinks on this. You're with GB News on TV and, of course, DAB radio. It's time for a short break now. I'll see you in a few moments.
Hi there. There will be some brighter spells around today for some, but for most it's cloudy and there will be outbreaks of rain in the far north of Scotland. That's associated with these weather fronts, which are just brushing the far north through the rest of today. And for the rest of the UK, well, we're still dominated by this large area of high pressure, keeping things dry generally and settled, but still rather cloudy. A lot of low cloud covering the hills of Wales, northern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and bringing mostly grey conditions, but a few brighter spells poking through for northeast England, perhaps parts of East Wales, eastern Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's going to feel cold under the cloud in the south, 3 to 5 Celsius, a bit milder further north, but across northern Scotland we do have some rain, especially for the Northern Isles, where it will also be windy as we end the day. Coastal gales for Shetland. Pushing through some showers overnight, but elsewhere across the UK, most places are dry. Again, a lot of cloud cover, but some breaks in the cloud coming south into northern England, the Midlands and Wales. And where we see some breaks, a touch of frost and a few fog patches are possible, but they'll be fairly localised because for the vast majority it's another cloudy start to the day on Wednesday. And that cloud is persisting across southern parts of the country through much of the day, but some holes developing more widely across East Wales, the Midlands, as well as into parts of northern England. Meanwhile, much of northern and western Scotland sees it turn wet and windy by the end of the afternoon, although it will be milder here compared to recent days. And further south, it will also be a touch milder with temperatures returning to around average. Wet and windy weather in the northwest pushes through during Wednesday evening. It sinks south into central and southern Scotland as well as Northern Ireland. But watch out for coastal gales, 50 to 60 mile-per-hour wind gusts for the north of the mainland of Scotland. It's going to stay blustery on Thursday, but a little brighter with further cloud breaks developing.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back to GB News on television and on DAB and, of course, on YouTube and on our app. As fears grow that Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine, the Prime Minister has warned that the UK, along with allies, will exact a forbidding price for any Russian incursion. Speaking to MPs, Boris Johnson said this could include imposing sanctions.
Any attack on his neighbour would be followed by tougher sanctions against Russia, further steps to help Ukraine defend herself, and by an increased NATO presence to protect our allies on NATO's eastern flank. The truth is that Russia's goal is to keep NATO forces away from her borders then if that is Russia's goal, then invading Ukraine could scarcely be more counterproductive.
Well, the Prime Minister also said the UK would contribute to any NATO troop deployments.
The British Army leads the NATO battle group in Estonia, and if Russia invades Ukraine, we would look to contribute to any new NATO deployments to protect our allies in Europe. In every contact with Russia, the UK and our allies have stressed our unity and our adherence to vital points of principle. We cannot bargain away the vision of a Europe whole and free that emerged in those amazing years from 1989 to 1991, healing the division of our continent by the Iron Curtain. We will not reopen that divide by agreeing to overturn the European security order because Russia has placed a gun to Ukraine's head. Nor can we accept the doctrine implicit in Russian proposals that all states are sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others.
Well, it comes as the US put 8,500 troops on alert for potential deployments to Europe. Russia has denied planning an invasion, but around 100,000 Russian soldiers have been deployed on Ukraine's border. We're joined in the studio now by GBNews Home and Security Editor Mark White. I mean, my two first guests were saying this is Putin's power play. The price of actually going to war in Ukraine would be far too big for Russia, so probably not going to happen. But there are things afoot, and we seem to be putting ourselves on a war footing. So where are we at? Is this Western power play to push back against Russian power play?
I think they're right that, Putin at the end of the day is looking for, negotiations. He wants something out of this. He doesn't want to put his troops in harm's way. He knows there'd be no swift and decisive action. It would be bloody and prolonged for his troops as much as it would be for the people in Ukraine as well. The difficulty is, I think, that when you are in the game of brinksmanship, then events can have a momentum of their own, and you can really find yourself in no time at all in some real difficulty here. And you're right, the rhetoric I think that we're getting, especially from the US, the UK and NATO in recent days, has been talking almost in absolute terms about, yes, it's only a matter of time now before Russia decides in whole or in part to invade Ukraine, and they will be met with swift and decisive action. But when you look at what the swift and decisive action will be, it is going to be sanctions, effectively. And we know that actually sanctions, as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, haven't really been that much of a deterrent to him in the past. It was interesting during the debate, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, asked, is it not time to look to put NATO military hardware and troops into Ukraine as well, to show proper solidarity with the Ukrainians and to back up that intention to show quick and decisive action. And of course, the Prime Minister batted that away with saying that, that's just not going to happen. And it's not. They're not a NATO member. They may be at some point in the future, who knows? That's obviously what Vladimir Putin doesn't want to happen. But at the moment, they're not NATO members. They are not going to get NATO military assets coming to their help if the worst were to happen.
It's interesting there, briefly, that you mentioned sanctions, because, of course, first of all, we need America's cooperation to be able to enforce those. And if we look at the situation in Afghanistan of late, there's now calls to strip those sanctions away because it's left a terribly bleak economic situation in that country of innocent people suffering as a consequence. It doesn't seem to be a very toothsome threat.
No, and I think what really the last 24 hours have been about in particular is the US with the UK and with European allies trying to show this united front to try to rebut the suggestions in recent days and weeks that there's been some kind of division. They're going all kinds of different ways on sanctions. What do we do in terms of providing some kind of military aid and training for Ukrainian forces? It was about, with that phone call with Biden last night, saying, look, here we are, we're united, and sanctions appears to be the threat, the main threat and way forward, combined, I think, with more in the way of these armaments that they've been putting into Ukraine. But that's as far as it goes, I think, as far as Ukraine is concerned. As to say, there's not going to be British or American or any other European country, for that matter's boots on the ground in terms of providing fighting forces to help Ukraine. Yes, they may provide some hardware and some training, but when the fighting starts, if it does, they are on their own. The hope is that this is just Putin and brinksmanship trying to squeeze whatever concessions he can out of the West. Who knows what his final calculation is, what concessions he wants, only he knows that. But as I say, it's a very dangerous game when you take this course, because events can run away from you.
Yeah, it's a very good point there, Mark. Thank you so much for joining me and giving me that insight. Well, you're at GB News on TV and DAB radio. Coming up, we'll be continuing this conversation about Ukraine and asking, where is Germany in all of this? But now it's time for a check on the news headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 2:33. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date in the GB News newsroom. The Prime Minister has warned if Russia invades Ukraine, the bloodshed will be comparable to the first war in Chechnya or Bosnia. Moscow has amassed around 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, raising fears of an imminent attack. Well, Boris Johnson told MPs this afternoon the British Army will work to protect its allies and sanctions against Russia will be severe. The Prime Minister has also told the Commons that he welcomes the police investigation into alleged parties at Downing Street during lockdown. It comes after Number 10 admitted the Prime Minister had a birthday celebration in June 2020 when COVID restrictions were in place. Earlier, the Met Police Commissioner confirmed a number of events are being looked at. Royal Mail has announced it's cutting 700 management jobs. It says the cost-cutting measure will save around £40 million a year. It follows what's been a difficult period over Christmas and the New Year, with staff absences peaking at one point at 15,000 individuals because of COVID and the Omicron variant. Now, former Brexit chief Lord Frost has joined a growing number of senior Conservatives asking the Prime Minister to scrap the national insurance tax hike in April. With the cost of living set to increase, he told the Daily Mail the £12 billion increase is not necessary or justified. You are up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. I'll keep you up to date across the afternoon. After a short break, we'll be back with Alex and We Need to Talk About.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. Now, as the situation escalates, NATO is putting forces on standby and sending ships and fighter jets to Eastern Europe. Denmark is contributing a frigate and 4 F-16s. Spain is bolstering NATO naval forces. France is ready to commit troops to Romania. The Netherlands is offering up 2 F-35s, and the US has said it can increase its military presence in Eastern Europe. Who is missing? Germany. The EU's biggest state, the nation to which all Eurozone nations are economically tied, and the country that rigged the system to post its disgraced ex-defence minister Ursula von der Leyen at the heart of the EU. To cut a long story short, Germany has not only played into Russia's hands, having greedily pandered to Putin for gas, it is now the largest stumbling block in any attempt to resolve the crisis. The head of the German Navy resigned at the weekend, denying Russia was planning an invasion and declined requests to send arms to Ukraine. They even stopped Estonia, a NATO member, from doing so. It was also reported Germany prevented the UK flying defence hardware over its airspace, something that Berlin denied. An obstinate Germany is proving that the EU is not only incapable of conjoined foreign policy, making its proposals to create an army frankly farcical, but that it actually undermines the defence alliances that we already have. Well, joining me on the show is the German political commentator, former UK editor of Die Zeit, Jürgen Kronig. Jürgen, what is Germany's relationship with Russia, would you say?
You described it in such striking terms that I'm forced into a defensive position as far as Germany is concerned. I'm very critical of Germany's foreign policy orientation anyhow. And I can only add to your despair, because Germany is militarily a toothless tiger, has been for years. For years, there have been complaints about tanks not being able to drive properly, not being useful, and so on. It's quite devastating, and now, of course, the ambivalence towards Russia and Putin's Russia. And you quoted this head of the Marine, who had to resign because he, like Biden, didn't know that he was overheard or that he was on interview. I mean, it is indeed not a very good picture which Germany gives. But at least Chancellor Olaf Scholz yesterday evening joined Biden, Johnson, Macron, and other luminaries from the EU and from NATO, and said any aggressive step will have serious consequences. But of course, here again, I have to say, Friedrich Merz, the new hardline conservative, at least this is how he is seen, leader of the now Christian democratic opposition, said under no circumstances should the international payment system SWIFT be part of harsh sanctions, because this would destroy the whole trade system. I don't know if you know what it means, but I mean, SWIFT will, of course, have devastating consequences for the country against which this measure is used. Iran is an example.
It's essentially here, if Germany is putting a barricade against SWIFT being involved in any process of creating sanctions, that's essentially putting a stake through the heart of the West's plan to apply stringent sanctions that may have a meaningful effect against Russia. And meanwhile, Germany is still in hoc, one might say, with Putin on Nord Stream 2 and encouraging this ongoing warfare when it comes to energy prices, handing, one could argue, Putin the upper hand when it comes to games over the economic warfare, let's say, on the European continent.
Yes, indeed. And what is more important to look back when this disaster started. It was under Merkel, Angela Merkel, who in 2011 switched off 8 well-working, safe nuclear power stations out of partly political reasons, because she wanted to gain voters, take away from the Greens to her party. And this, of course, was a beginning. And at the same time, of course, gas and fracking was forbidden, was not possible in Germany, as, by the way, in Britain, unfortunately, too. And therefore, the dependency on Russian gas and oil has steadily increased over the years. And I don't know if you know the figures, but Germany is relying on more than 60% of the gas from Russia and 42% of oil. This of a nation which, of course, was claiming to be a leader of the Green Revolution in Europe and set an example for the world. And what in reality, of course, not only does it have disastrous consequences, as we can now see unfold in foreign policy, in international foreign terms, in relation to Russia, but the carbon dioxide, if they are so devastatingly dangerous, carbon dioxide emissions have risen over the last few years, because Germany now has to go back to, and has been going back to, the dirtiest form of fossil fuels, coal and even lignite, flattening forests in Germany to dig out more lignite out of the ground, because otherwise the lights go out. I mean, it's a devastating result of Angela Merkel, who was seen by many people, and I always said, don't be too positive about Angela Merkel, by many people in this country as well, as a safe pair of hands. She was not safe at all.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it seems to me that if Putin doesn't get the concessions he wants, he actually has the ability to precipitate an economic crisis through an energy crisis, essentially, in gas prices in Germany, which, of course, will affect the entire of Europe, particularly Eurozone nations whose economies are so closely tied to Germany. So Germany has really created a bit of a mess here. It pretty much holds the key to get us out of it.
But indeed, I don't want to belittle Germany's responsibility, but I have to say Britain did exactly do the same mistake, and even in a way is caught in a more sinister situation, because they in the 1990s, in 2007, the Parliament decided to in favor of a climate change bill. And only 15 or 10 MPs, among them Peter Lilly and Graham Stringer from the Labour Party, opposed this. All the others voted in favor. And this makes the British government even more forced to follow this path, because they need another vote in the House of Parliament to overturn this, while at least Germany, theoretically, if a chancellor was so intent to do, could change its energy policy and go nuclear. And so, of course, they don't do that at the moment, because the Germans are slightly, in this case, nature lovers and fearful of nuclear power, despite all the evidence to the contrary.
Jürgen, thank you so much for joining me. That's Jürgen Koenig there, who is the former UK editor of Die Zeit. Well, naivety on full display, it seems, when it comes to geopolitics. Look where those woke green policies got us. Now, does anybody really care about the latest Partygate leak? The now apparent drip-fed vendetta against the Prime Minister may well have overplayed its hand and be having the reverse effect on a wearying public with a bombardment of peccadillos. Now the Prime Minister is under investigation by the Met Police for potential infringements, which, if found guilty, would place Boris in a very unique predicament of being a Prime Minister that broke the law, his law. But the police investigation has another effect. It knocks the official inquiry led by Sue Gray into the long grass, potentially saving the PM's bacon, as real-world matters make a birthday cake faux pas look rather trivial, juxtaposed with mounting geopolitical tensions. But who's behind this, and are they now just wasting the country's patience and time? Well, joining us now is behavioural psychologist Jo Hemmings. Jo, all of these twists and turns certainly aren't easy on the mind, but do you think it's been a bit of overkill and now the public are tired by it, don't care less and want to move on from the subject? And frankly, the constant leak of information may have actually had the reverse effect, perhaps, to what the perpetrator's intention was.
Yeah, I mean, it has become quite exhausting. So it's a daily, almost, or 3 times a week, 4 times a week. There's another drip-fed, as you say, revelation. And you kind of start to get a bit of exhausted of it. And so you can't feel the same anger or resentment or whatever it was we felt by the first party. And I think there's a bit of sympathy going out there for Boris Johnson because, firstly, look, aside from this, he stepped into the role of PM. He didn't anticipate he'd be going through having to deal with a pandemic. He did pretty well through vaccine rollout and other things. And secondly, I feel there aren't many of us who would say we haven't tried to cover up something to protect ourselves, perhaps in the past. And we were not, again, expecting a kind of roller coaster of unveiling one fib, one untruth, whatever we told, protect ourselves, to come at us in this way. And he's now sort of pretty much lost control. It is a daily thing. We're hearing more and more and more and more. We're seeing, as you say, what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, of which he has responded very well. And I just think you can go over, it's gone into overkill. Get that information out there. We know he didn't own it in the beginning. Something, he'll have to be accountable in some way. But it's sort of becoming an irritant when people want to move on news-wise to other things that are going on in the world that are far more important currently.
I mean, certainly, if the Met Police investigation finds that the Prime Minister has broken the law, that makes his position very untenable. But anybody who's got a concept of how police investigations work and how a charge is brought, you'd have to be inside the Prime Minister's brain to prove that he intentionally went to a party. So it seems to me that this could well save him. Does that not then put him in a position where he's the one who's been under a prolonged campaign of attack against him? He's been made the underdog. And actually, at the back of this, he might come out quite emboldened because he survived the attack, kept his cool and gone about being fairly statesmanlike when it comes to the geopolitical situation.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's exactly it. So he will feel vindicated in some way. And because he has had no real control, it's been the press and the media, uncovering something every day. Once that has passed on, he will get that sense of, look, I can harness enthusiasm again, I can feel that I've got a bit of control back. And yeah, it could very definitely have the reverse effect, where if he gets through this, he can kind of get through anything, because it's been going on and on and on. And he's managed to survive this far. So if he gets through to the other side and keeps his job, we will see someone who's going to absolutely prove to himself and to the public that he's 100% worthy of the job that he holds.
Jo, fascinating insights there. Jo Hemmings, who's a behavioural psychologist, on, well, frankly, how this campaign against Boris might now be working in his favour. Now, it's been a UK urban myth that a pregnant woman can legally relieve herself in a policeman's hat. It's a quirky falsehood, but it betrays something greater: the concept of the gentleman copper. Look to any Hollywood movie and the twee caricature of the British Bobby is unfailingly polite and quaintly respected. Well, that's hardly the impression we get today, with reports of lad locker room culture, obscene WhatsApp groups and policemen charged with crimes from assault to rape. The latest grim story emanating from the Met Police is that of a female philosophy professor who was arrested for obstructing police during a stop and search in Hackney. When taken to the station, they pinned her down and ripped off her clothes. They mocked her body hair and made lewd comments about the smell of her underwear. The professor even accused officers of probing between her legs as she was held down naked. When an investigation into the events of that day in 2013 was conducted, the police withheld video footage, taking 8 years to provide an official apology and reopen the investigation into police conduct. So do we have a problem with a toxic culture in the police ranks? I'm delighted now to be joined by Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, Lisa Townsend. Lisa, I mean, it's a shocking story, isn't it?
Good afternoon, Alex. Yes, it absolutely is. Unfortunately, it's another shocking story, unfortunately, from policing. And actually, I think the Met put it probably best themselves when they said it was sexist, derogatory and unacceptable.
I mean, it's not just sexist, it sounds to me almost like assault here and a big police cover-up. 8 years, the video footage wasn't used. I mean, this is just the latest in a sequence of reports we've had about, frankly, abhorrent behaviour coming from inside the police force that is far removed from figures of authority that the public should trust and respect. How do we tackle this and restore that public trust and make sure there isn't some sort of toxic lads' locker room culture that's inherent within UK policing?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Alex. I think that's exactly what this goes to, which is around trust in policing, which, of course, is something that we all recognise the importance of, both inside and outside of policing. And it is a wider problem. Let's be honest, this isn't a problem that affects policing only. This is clearly a societal issue that we've been battling for a very long time around this toxicity and, arguably misogyny that exists in society. And certainly, whilst I would never go so far as to say that policing is itself misogynistic, of course, in the way that there are elements of it in society, there will be, and there are, unfortunately, elements of it within policing. And when something like this happens, it is incredibly damaging for policing and for trust in policing. And when I speak to officers here in Surrey, I know that they feel very damaged by these kind of reports as well, because the truth is the vast majority of officers, male and female, are absolutely those that we can and should be putting our trust in. And we have a small amount of officers who, when they behave like this, and as you said, it's absolutely unacceptable that it took over 8 years. This case happened in 2013 to come to light. And I think that is actually part of the problem. The police have got to be much better at recognising when there's a problem and dealing with it. And so I think it's so important that we work within policing and outside of policing and in society to make sure that it's absolutely clear, as it is in this case, that these kind of comments, these kind of actions are absolutely unacceptable.
And how do you, I mean, you're a police and crime commissioner, so when it comes to these sorts of issues, I assume that that's part of your day job and exactly what you're expected to deal with. So how do you go about dealing with it?
Well, that's right, Alex. And, one of the jobs of the Police and Crime Commissioner is to hold the Chief Constable to account. And I have regular meetings with the Chief Constable here in Surrey and with the top team and with officers. And this is something that we talk about an awful lot. Now, Surrey actually has a very good record in terms of how we deal with all of our everybody across Surrey, not just women. But it is something that we're very, very conscious of and constantly striving to be better at, and making sure that there is a lot of training going on, which there is. All of our trainers all of our officers who work in custody are, of course, trained and have other officers that they can talk to. And it's certainly not something that anybody in Surrey would find remotely acceptable. And I think as Police and Crime Commissioners, we absolutely have a duty to set those standards.
Lisa Townsend, thank you ever so much for joining me, Police and Crime Commissioner there in Surrey. Well, that's it for me for today. Join me again for We Need to Talk About again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 o'clock. Have a wonderful afternoon. Coming up next is Darren, but first, here's the weather.
Hi there. There will be some brighter spells around today for some, but for most it's cloudy and there will be outbreaks of rain in the far north of Scotland. That's associated with these weather fronts, which are just brushing the far north through the rest of today. And for the rest of the UK, well, we're still dominated by this large area of high pressure, keeping things dry generally and settled, but still rather cloudy. A lot of low cloud covering the hills of Wales, Northern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and bringing mostly grey conditions, but a few brighter spells poking through for North East England, perhaps parts of East Wales, Eastern Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's going to feel cold under the cloud in the south, 3 to 5 Celsius. A bit milder further north, but across northern Scotland we do have some rain, especially for the Northern Isles, where it will also be windy as we end the day. Coastal gales for Shetland. Pushing through some showers overnight, but elsewhere across the UK, most places are dry. Again, a lot of cloud cover, but some breaks in the cloud coming south into northern England, the Midlands and Wales. And where we see some breaks, a touch of frost and a few fog patches are possible, but they'll be fairly localised because for the vast majority it's another cloudy start to the day on Wednesday. And that cloud persisting across southern parts of the country through much of the day, but some holes developing more widely across East Wales, the Midlands, as well as into parts of northern England. Meanwhile, much of northern and western Scotland sees it turn wet and windy by the end of the afternoon, although it will be milder here compared to recent days. And further south, it will also be a touch milder with temperatures returning to around average. Wet and windy weather in the northwest pushes through during Wednesday evening. It sinks south into central and southern Scotland as well as Northern Ireland. But watch out for coastal gales, 50 to 60 mile-per-hour wind gusts for the north of the mainland of Scotland. It's going to stay blustery on Thursday, but